It is always a delight when I get the opportunity to see that one of the most well-known left-wing philosophers out there, Slavoj Zizek, writes about a topic that I also often talk about. And in this case, it is network states. And so if you don't know who Slavoj Zizek is, self-described communist philosopher, if you know who he is, you know kind of what he's about.
And so on. This, but authority to make it clear, what do I mean by this? Doing should clear or said something like this, and so on and so on. So by this, let's not have a misunderstanding here. This can be really justice and so on and so on. But my basic problem is this one. Look, now there is the of how ethics. What I meant is the following things: is jokes and so on. But there is talking from my and so on. Blah blah blah.
I don't always agree with everything that he says, but he's a very interesting thinker nonetheless. And so back in March this year, he had published a piece on his Substack called Network States, No Thanks. And it was, unfortunately, I'm not a paid subscriber of his Substack, so I never got to read the whole thing. I read a bit of it, and I had been thinking about writing about it, but it kind of didn't make sense for me to talk about it if I didn't get the whole thing. I just kind of forgot. And so recently, I saw that some people created a document where they took his writing and posted it on Fileverse and shared it with a bunch of people. And so I think, if Zizek found out about this, I don't think he'd be that mad. Honestly, I'm sure he'd have some contrarian, interesting thing to say about his work being stolen and then posted on the web for anyone to read. But it reminded me again that I wanted to actually take a read to read this piece. And so I thought now was a good chance to do that now that it's freely available. And so I thought what I'd do is kind of go through some of the bits that he writes. Not going to go through the whole thing because it's, I'm not just going to read it to you, but I thought I would highlight some of the ones I thought were the most interesting. And then we could talk a little bit about that. Though the piece overall is fairly interesting, he kind of relates network states to the current Trump regime. I mean, this was back in March, so some things have changed slightly, but more or less, I think, still relevant. So yeah, so maybe let's just go through some of the stuff that I've highlighted. I definitely recommend reading it, the whole thing. I'll put a link in the description, I'm sure. I'm sure Slavoj will not get mad at me for doing that. But yeah, so let's kind of go in chronological order, some of the things that I highlighted that I thought would be interesting to talk about. So in the piece, he immediately makes the connection between network states and Curtis Yarvin. Curtis Yarvin, in case you don't know already, dark Enlightenment philosopher, kind of the father of the alt-right, is kind of presumed to have a lot of very close connections with Elon Musk, with several tech CEOs, Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen. A lot of them are fans of Curtis Yarvin's writing. Curtis Yarvin was most known for his blog called Unreserved Qualifications or something like that. He wrote under the pseudonym Mencius Moldbug, and essentially it was a lot of pro-eugenics, pro-authoritarian type of right-wing writing, to kind of summarize it quickly. And also to kind of help summarize it, I think this little piece where he says, or he's talking about Curtis Yarvin, and he says, describing it, the executive unencumbered by liberal democratic procedures rule efficiently, much like a CEO monarch. Yarvin admires Deng Xiaoping for his pragmatic and market-oriented authoritarianism and the city-state of Singapore as an example of a successful authoritarian regime. He sees the U.S. as soft on crime, dominated by economic and democratic delusions. So I think what's interesting to know is that Zizek actually knows Curtis Yarvin and knows about that work. Maybe it's not so surprising, but I thought it was interesting. He immediately makes a connection. Yarvin has always been an advocate of states being controlled by a CEO monarch, or for states to be run like companies, and for the person who runs the company, the CEO, to effectively be a monarch, a king. He believes in more executive power given to fewer people, if not one person, as the ideal form of government. This is also mirrored in a lot of network state writing. In case you guys haven't seen all of my podcast episodes and what I've been doing in my investigations about the network state, that this is also something that is reflected in the network state book written by Balaji Srinivasan. But so let's continue. So today, Trump himself already functions as a big corporation CEO in his negotiations to end the Ukraine war. Ukraine is expected to pay $500 billion for help, providing the US with free access to minerals and other natural resources, while Russia will pay nothing for its devastation of Ukraine. And so this is, I think, an interesting point to make, that already our states are being run kind of like corporations. I mean, if you're in the US or even keeping up with things happening in the US, whenever Trump was kind of demanding that in order to get more aid from the US, Ukraine needed to give the US much more access to its minerals and resources. So it's basically like a very transactional nature in kind of the dealings it was having with other states. Transactional in also a business sense, like overt, like we need to profit off of this if you want us to help you. And so this already kind of gives, a little bit of a taste of what Yarvin's, dark enlightened alt-right utopia would kind of look like. We already kind of live in it. And so Yarvin, kind of advocating for this stuff for me is like it's kind of silly, because much of what they advocate for are already part of like kind of the biggest problems with how states are run and issues with corruption and so forth. It's this transactional nature that people like Trump are so explicit in expecting. And not to say that this is specific to even Republicans or whatever. I mean, this is a part of geopolitics. I think it's just kind of like the brazen nature in which Trump does this. And, this is all rooted in a world system that is dominated by capitalism. So in many ways, Trump is just kind of advocating on behalf of the US capitalist class in a way. And so after that, he kind of jumps from Trumpism, explains a little bit about Balaji's book. So Balaji Srinivasan's book, The Network State, How to Start a New Country, proposes an even more radical solution, not to change an existing state, like many libertarians often do, but to start a new state. We start new companies like Google, we start new communities like Facebook, we start new currencies like Bitcoin and Ethereum. Can we start new countries? This is a quote from Balaji. The book challenges traditional notions of nation states, proposing a future where online communities can crowdfund territory and transform into sovereign entities, so-called network states. And so, yeah, I think, to me, what's really interesting is that, Zizek is making a connection that already made, several years ago, since basically even more or less the publishing of the Network State book. I was making these connections with Curtis Yarvin and his work and the Dark Enlightenment. Part of it you could have made, or I made in that point, because there's already a known connection between Balaji and Curtis Yarvin. I mean, there are already recorded accounts of them having email exchanges or being part of large email groups or chains where they kind of go at each other a little bit, but are agreeing on a lot of the same principles, because a lot of the people in the tech VC world in the United States were in these big groups with Curtis Yarvin somehow. His writing on, advocating for a CEO dictatorship, somehow, I wonder why, was very popular with tech CEOs. And so, yeah, I like this next quote. I thought it was an interesting point that he made. So he says, the idea of a network state is Platonism at its purest. No reference to tradition is needed. We first digitally imagine a state and then apply the idea to an actual territory. Incidentally, not unlike the communist attempts to create a new man. So he, of course, he's being a little bit, controversial by making these comparisons with kind of communist thinkers around the new man. But what I specifically wanted to focus on is what he calls the Platonism of the network state, which is kind of the exact kind of thing that I was pointing at in my piece for Outland magazine a couple of years ago. So right here, Fork Your Society, I Want Out, that I wrote in 2023, where I said the Srinivasan has proposed a revolution in a form of statecraft, but it's limited by metaphors of software development. So by Platonism, what he's talking about is an idealism about how kind of states ought to be, but rooted in a kind of digital utopia. That's kind of like his focus. He talks about digital utopianism more so, whereas for me, I made the connection more specifically to tech startups, that the entire idea around network states was and is rooted in how someone starts a tech startup. You kind of, you focus on scaling up, right? You like start small with the intention of scaling up. Then and includes a lot of like investment language. So the book itself, I mean, it's unsurprising because Balaji is an entrepreneur, a VC, venture capitalist, a big investor. So he takes like the things that he knows and where he made his money at, and just tries to apply that on statecraft, which is really silly because like it at the same time it comes with a Platonism, of course, like what Zizek is saying with like the way that the digital world works. So like kind of talks about, forking the code base of the United States, which is like kind of trying to make the metaphor of forking code in software, which works in software great because you can make a limitless amount of code. It's just text, right? But in the case of land is extremely material, right? You can't simply copy and paste land. And so what it ends up putting network states, or the easy comparison to make for network states, is essentially neocolonialism. It's saying that like they try to take things that are, by using models rooted in such a capitalistic logic, they are, unironically, like reverting back to like very colonial tropes about how people view and use land. And yeah, the book is very scant on details on how you deal with other states whenever you're trying to claim land, because last I checked, the vast majority of the earth is already claimed. But anyways, if we keep going, another thing I highlighted is in this paragraph near the end where he says, "What strikes the eye is how far this project is from the standard rightist populist stance on which fascism relies. Emphasis on blood and soil, or remaining faithful to one's own specific way of life, grounded in traditional values. Are we then nonetheless dealing with marginal utopian attempts? Unfortunately, no. The project of digital elites to break countries into small territories run by tech corporations already has predecessors. From the 16th century Dutch East India Company, which functioned as a state in today's Indonesia, up to today's special economic zones. Not to mention Trump, whose projects concerning Greenland and Gaza move in the same direction. Apropos Gaza, Trump used a precise term. The U.S. will take over and own Gaza, neither a colony, says there would be no native population as Gaza would be empty, nor a new U.S. state, but a true network state. Trump plans to take over empty territory and reboot it from zero." So yeah, Zizek is just making these connections already, that much of the rhetoric and even reality, to be honest, of much of what network states have been able to achieve is neocolonial in nature. It's like foreign capital coming into a place, which ends up having anti-democratic effects of the people who actually live in it. In the case with Gaza, this is just like with an assumption of kind of like, absolute genocide and ethnic cleansing. In the case of Trump, what's also interesting is that Balaji does compare network states to tech Zionism. That is something that he legitimately has said before. He says he's looking for a tech Zionism. So yeah, neocolonial. And then at the very end of the piece, he says, "This is the implacable dark side of network states, and one of the numerous arguments that Carlo Rovelli was right when he wrote that there will have to be a global federation of states. The only choice is whether it will emerge before or after a nuclear war." So yeah, this is kind of like a more bleak, potentially bleak, I think you can look at it in many ways, kind of statement that, and I tend to agree with it, that it's kind of like a fantasy to think that we could have each our own sovereign little space where we don't talk to each other except via trade and don't have to, worry about what others are doing in those faraway lands. The world is already globalized. Technology has already connected the world at such a rate so far beyond than what we ever expected, that sort of some type of global governance is necessary, and of course already happens with the United Nations, and you could consider the World Economic Forum, the World Bank. Like these things already happen largely at a kind of global technocratic capitalist level and from a particular class of people. And so I think, at least for me, what it means is like, I mean, I'm inspired a lot by the writings from Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein, socialist, well-known socialist, where he does write about the need essentially for a global government. To me, it feels like that's kind of potentially necessary in some way, not in the sense of like one world state that commands everything for everyone, but in the sense of the need for coordinated governance to put forth certain humanistic ideals about how we interact with one another, which again is already the case. It already happens. What I'm interested in is how do we do that from a place where we are advocating for the rights of working class people, and that the governance is spread out amongst more players and entities and people, so that we don't trample on each other's civil rights and like socioeconomic rights. So yeah, this was like a super big treat. Again, this was published on Fileverse. So if you go to fileverse.io, I highly recommend it if you're looking for a Google Drive alternative, especially. It is a decentralized alternative to Google Drive if you're ever working on documents and you are worried about the potential censorship of states, then I recommend Fileverse. So definitely check it out. Maybe occasionally you could share some of Zizek's writing if you have a paid subscription and want to pass it on to me. But yeah, there you go. I hope that was interesting. I just wanted to kind of give it a look and share it with others.